So today we're talking wheel spacers on my Toyota Tacoma. Specifically, I got some Amazon wheel spacers. Just for fun, if you go ahead and Google whatever vehicle you drive, whether it's a Nissan Xterra, Toyota Tacoma, or anything in between, and go ahead and throw a wheel spacer on the end of it, you will see endless forum debates about whether they're safe, they're gonna make your wheels fall off, all sorts of disasters will happen, versus I've been running them for X number of years and they're okay, versus if you do run wheel spacers, only get a reputable brand, because only the high dollar expensive ones that are known and reputable are to be trusted. And I wanted to do a little bit of a video because I did get, like I said, Amazon wheel spacers. I did run rear wheel spacers on my Nissan Xterra, and I got those from Motorsport Tech, or Bora, Bulletproof Off-Road Adapters. That is one of the companies highly recommended across the internet and the off-road world, right along with Spider Tracks. Those are made in the USA in local machine shops that know four-wheeling and off-road driving. Made in the USA, source steel, good things like that. They are definitely good. Like, I love the wheel spacers that I had on the Nissan Xterra. They work perfect and they fit great. That being said, it was $150 for two versus this was like $80 for four. So can you find good wheel spacers on Amazon? So tapping into some of my prior professional experience as a test engineer, I would commonly get asked the question, we want to take part A, it's not changing at all, but we want to take it from supplier B and move it to supplier C. What does the test plan look like to ensure that they function the same? And I would always start off with, what is the material properties, what is the geometry? If you can prove to me that the geometry is the same, and you can prove to me that the material properties are the same, then physics would dictate that it's going to behave the same way. And so that's what I'm really kind of basing this off of for why I felt comfortable getting Amazon wheel spacers. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the design of what you actually want to look for when trying to select a wheel spacer. So the first thing to know is less about the wheel spacer itself and more about how the actual hub and wheels fit up. So everybody knows about lug nuts, and that's what you actually fasten to hold the rim to it. But the important thing to note, it's a little bit more of a subtle feature, is the actual hub itself. This is a cylinder that actually protrudes a little bit off of this flat surface right here. And when you look on the inside of your rim, you see here's the bolt flange that actually mates up where those lug nuts are, but you actually have a recessed cavity right here, and that actually fits over that cylinder that sticks out. So the point is that you want a tight fit between this inner bore of your rim and this outer bore of your hub. So if you get a cheap spacer that is not designed specifically for your vehicle, it can have a generically large hole in the center, and what that means is, it might line up with the lug studs themselves, but then it's not going to sit flush on the outer surface of this hub. And that means that that can transfer some of the load into your wheel studs that they're not normally designed to carry. The wheel stud's main function is to hold the tire onto the actual hub itself, and on the drive wheels, it transfers torque from your drive shafts or your CV axles into the rim to drive you forward. But they're not necessarily designed to take, say, a vertical shock loading of driving fast and going into a pothole, for instance. So if you follow the load path, when you go into a big pothole, the big shock loading goes into your tire is connected to your rim gets pushed up. And you want the inner bore of your rim to then push onto this hub, which pushes the entire hub assembly upwards. If you don't have that contact there, what that means is that all of these wheel studs are what's absorbing that type of impact. The other thing to consider is that if you get, say, the generic type of wheel spacer that is just a spacer without its own studs, you just slip them on here, that spaces your rim off of this surface. That also spaces your rim outward enough where it can actually be off of the end of the hub, and that does the same type of thing. The other thing to consider is it'll also reduce the amount of thread engagement. When you tighten your lug nuts on, you want at least 7 turns of your lug nut of thread engagement to make sure that they stay on. So what does a wheel spacer look like that I would say is a good design? And I would say it's also called an adapter when they have their own set of lug studs here, but this is a ring of a certain thickness, and then you use your existing lug studs to bolt it onto the hub, and it's got a center bore here on the inside that should mate up with the outer surface of that bore. And then it also has a lip that sticks out, so your rim sits on that lip. So when you actually bolt it all down, it should still be one tight bolted joint. And again, if you take into account the load path of going into a pothole, the shock load goes into your tire, which goes into your rim, which then goes into this lip, which pushes the entire spacer up, which then puts the load through this surface, which then goes into your hub. So it's still transferring that load away from the lug studs and directly into the structural parts of the hub. That's what you'd want to do. So on the topic of material properties, the higher end wheel spacers use aircraft grade aluminum. There's an actual standard that they reference. You can find ones on Amazon that reference that same standard. That being said, I acknowledge you are kind of taking a leap of faith of assuming that these companies, often manufactured in China and are no-name brands, you're assuming that they're telling the truth. It's always possible that they are lying to you or misleading you. So on the topic of thread engagement, I specifically looked for a set that had long reach or extended lug nuts. So standard acorn style lug nuts, they'll have that taper cone on the end, but they don't have the cylinder that sticks out. Now what this does is eliminate the problem that can arise where if you don't have that extended cylinder, and depending on the thickness of your wheel spacer and the thickness of material based on how they did the center bore here, that can end up not having enough thread engagement where you go to bolt on your wheel spacer and you might only have 2 or 3 forced threads holding it on, and that can lead to problems. So if you read fine print on even the reputable manufacturers, they'll tell you that extended reach lug studs may need to be installed. So if you get a thick wheel spacer, this might not be enough lug stud to actually hold the wheel spacer on. The other thing to consider is the wheel studs themselves. You're hoping that they're good quality. They advertise them as upgraded wheel studs. It's grade 12.9, so that's a metric 12 1.5 thread pitch, and 12.9 is really the highest common standard. Really 10.9 is probably the highest common standard for hardware. 12.9 is one above that, is a little harder to find. So this is the first time I'm fitting this wheel spacer up, but I'm just going to fit it up and see how much thread engagement I get, how well it fits. So the first thing that I do is I got it slid into place. I can rotate it axially because there is play around the lug studs, as there should be. The holes in the actual spacer should actually be oversized compared to the stud, so that way that cylinder can slide over it. But what I'm doing is actually trying to slide the spacer side to side, and there is no slop between that inner bore and the outer bore. So that tells me that the actual counter bore here is correct. Now in this instance, the Tacoma has a 106 millimeter counter bore, I believe is what it is. I've also seen some wheel spacers that are advertised for Tacomas that have a 108, so you end up with a 1 millimeter gap all around. Well, that's going to lead to that problem like I described earlier. So you can see how much threads are unused at the top of the lug nut here. However, I did go ahead and count how many full rotations I was able to get, and there was about 9 3/4 rotation of the lug nut before it was started to get seated, and I haven't even fully torqued it yet. So that does tell me that that long reach extension on the end of the lug nut, it's a good thing to have, because otherwise you would probably only have 3 or 4 turns of the lug nut and thread engagement to hold it on. Now this specific set of wheel spacers came with 2 things of thread locker. I am not going to use thread locker. Some people want to, but red is usually heat resistant, so you usually have to get some type of torch to heat it up afterwards. And any time that I have to replace the rotor or something, I don't want to have to be torching these things to take them off. With this much thread engagement and proper torques, you know, I never worried about my rims falling off while going down the street when properly torqued, so I wouldn't expect the spacer to fall off. That being said, I will go ahead and also rely on some of my past professional experience as a reliability engineer, and from a theoretical standpoint, adding any type of component does increase your probability of failure. For instance, a wheel spacer is impossible to fail if it's not on the vehicle. So you are adding 6 more studs, 6 more lug nuts, and this block of aluminum. So, you know, it is a non-zero fail rate compared to not having it. So of important to note is I'm tightening all of these by hand. I want to be very careful to make sure that the threads of the lug nuts that were supplied with the spacer, which are now being threaded onto the existing wheel studs, I want to make sure that those go on cleanly, and I don't want to just, you know, blast them with an impact driver. So right now I'm just snugging them up, and then to do a final torque, I will have to either wedge something up against the brake pedal to squeeze the brakes shut so the whole wheel doesn't turn, or I can wedge something into the fins of the rotor and the brake caliper here and then do the final torque that way. And then I'll fit up the rim and just see how it fits. Tacoma lug nuts are 83 foot-pounds, so I'll go ahead and torque them in a star pattern. So now you go ahead and put your rim on place on the studs that came on the wheel spacer, and you use the existing vehicle lug nuts to fasten your rim to the studs. Now with some weight back on the tire, I can do a full torque of the regular lug nuts. So here's the stance with the 1.25 inch wheel spacer on the front. This is the stance without it. You can see it pokes out just a little bit more. Not significant. So if it's such a subtle look difference, why would people run wheel spacers? And really, to me, there's one specific reason to run wheel spacers, but in general, wheel spacers are for someone that doesn't want to change out their rims. So on my Nissan Xterra, I ran the 1-inch wheel spacers in the rear, and that was because I had 15/7 stock rims that had 5.5-inch back spacing. So they were pretty well inboard, and when the axle would articulate, the extra width of that 12.5-inch wide tire on that 7-inch rim would balloon out a lot, and it would rub up on the frame rails. So I just spaced them out 1 extra inch, so then I got full axle articulation without rubbing up on the frame rail. Now on the Tacoma, I am kind of planning ahead a little bit, but I got 265 75 16s on there right now. But I gotta say, this kind of falls into a buy once, cry once things, because man, those 285 sure are calling my name. And the problem is on the front, on the Toyota Tacoma, you need extra offset and extra width to your stance in order to clear them on the front. I'll show you why. So on the front suspension, the upper control arm, you can see it right here. And the spindle connector goes all the way up, and the ball joint is actually right in line with the tire. You can see this gap where my hand is right now. It's about 1 inch wide, so I definitely don't have much room to go to 285s because I'm going to start rubbing on the ball joint here. So you really need to space that wheel outboard to be able to fit a 285 wide tire without starting to rub on this upper ball joint and control arm. Be aware that it's always harder to fit larger tires on the front, and the specific area of concern is going to be while you turn your tires inboard and outward, because the farther outboard your tire is, then when they start to pivot, they're going to start hitting into this stuff more. So a cab mount chop is common on Tacomas. That's this hunk of sheet metal right here. Take an angle grinder or plasma cutter, cut it off, cut it back maybe 1/4 inch and weld a plate to it so you still get some structural rigidity to it. But right now I'm going to go ahead and steer my front tires in the full arc just so I can see what it may or may not be hitting and rubbing in this back area. So another final closing note here. One, it's commonly misconstrued that wheel spacers apply more load to your hub and your bearings. That is true compared to your stock rim or an existing rim without a wheel spacer. However, it's no different than getting the actual rim designed with that amount of offset. That being said, for the thousands of pounds that would sit and the hub load that you would get in those bearings, an extra inch or 1.25 inches in my case is not going to make that drastic of a difference. So that's really something not to worry about. Another thing to be aware of is that it does add a little bit of complexity to your hubs and your rear axle. So if you are servicing brake drums, for instance, now you got to take a wheel spacer off. Some mechanic shops do not want to touch wheel spacers and will not bolt up rims to wheel spacers. In my experience, and from what I've read online, that's mostly chain type tire shops like Firestone or something like that. Maybe Discount Tire doesn't want to do them for, lawyer and safety reasons. Usually a mom and pop shop are going to be a little more lenient on that. But then you also got to be careful about tire shops just blindly throwing on an impact wrench, over torquing things, stripping out or breaking a wheel stud on your wheel spacer. But then you got to go find a wheel stud that fits that same wheel spacer. It shouldn't be too difficult, but it is just, again, a little bit more of a headache. So my general recommendation would be to only run wheel spacers, not for a cosmetic reason, but for specifically alleviating a tire clearance issue when you've already invested the money into rims or tires and they've already been installed and you thought you had enough clearance with your lift or whatever, and then you ended up not. The wheel spacer is kind of the last resort. I think it's a little bit easier to take that plunge if you're doing your own maintenance anyway, so you don't got to worry about mechanics and tire shops misinstalling or not torquing things correctly the next time around, because like I said, it does add a chunk of aluminum and it does add 6 more studs and 6 more lug nuts. More probability of failure, right? Anyway, that's my thoughts on wheel spacers. I think they can be safe if they are designed properly and installed properly, if you make sure that you actually have proper thread engagement. It's hard to tell visually if they're going to be balanced and not cause vibration issues, so that's why you got to install them, take them for a test drive. If I don't like them, I'll return it back to Amazon and, get my money back. So anyway, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you like the content of these videos. See you in the next one.